Good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar, which is going to be done by Tom Ridgman. Just a few basic housekeeping bits before we get going. First of all, we're very pleased to welcome you all this evening. This is the sequence of Ely Darlaston Association webinars, and we're running them every fortnight on Thursday evening. So that means the next one is going to be Thursday, the 11th of February. And there'll be details of the forthcoming talk on the district Facebook page and email list. So if you are having trouble getting hold of copies of future webinar events, do drop me a line at education@cambridgeringing.info. So that's education@cambridgeringing.info. If you're wanting to know what the future webinar program is going to be, or having trouble getting hold of a list of forthcoming events. It's only going to be the microphones and video cameras on mine and Tom's computers that are in use tonight. Please do feel free to move around and relax and enjoy yourself during the event. We won't be disturbing anyone. So without much further ado, I'd like to introduce Tom Ridgman. So he's going to talk tonight on the horrible histories.
Right, hello everybody. Let me just get the screen sharing bit, which is that one with a bit of luck.
Now you see, we practiced this just a few minutes ago. We've got your presenter view up, so maybe just click swap displays up there at the top.
Okie dokie. There we go.
Perfect. Wonderful.
Right. Super.
Right. So I shall hand over to you, Tom. Thank you very much for being with us tonight, and I'm sure everyone's looking forward to your talk. Obviously, one of the most popular ones from the first series, so it's very good to see you back this year as well.
Thank you. Pleasure as ever. So a bit of introduction. Now, I'm not a historian. Most of you know I pretend to be an engineer. And I went into this thinking history was a pretty simple stuff, really. Stuff had happened and it had been recorded. But no. What I found was history is not at all what I thought it was. Historians disagree, and some of them have several different opinions, so you don't know what's true from that point of view. And then they discover a new fact, and so history changes. And who'd have thought that? And the other aspect of history is that what we know is about what's left behind. So if our civilization was to vanish tomorrow, all our electronic witterings, nobody would ever know about those. They'd look at Stonehenge and things like that, and they'd try and work out what sort of people we were from that. This is a bit sort of relevant to bell ringing because there may have been, for all we know, lots and lots of iron bells. We know the Romans had iron bells, but of course we won't ever see those because they've all long gone and rusted, whereas bronze bells last quite well. So why a horrible history? What do we mean by that? Well, all I really wanted to do with that was to distance myself from proper historians like Gareth Davis and John Eisel and people who do this kind of thing really properly. And so using the type of horrible history approaches that you get in children's books, mine's based on, well, lots of Wikipedia, that's the kind of bulk of the stew, a little bit of old Victorian clergymen because they wrote about that at length, and then a bit of spicing with some random speculation, sort of, well, it could have been done like this. So that's what I mean by a horrible history. Right, next thing is what sort of perspectives or what lenses I want you to think about while we're doing this. So bells are used for quite a number of different things. Over the years, they have a practical uses, which we know. We mostly use them for pleasure. At least I hope most people are getting some pleasure. It may not feel like it at the time. And then there's spiritual. And in spiritual, I'm thinking wider than religion. I'm going to do something a little bit philosophical, but don't worry too much. It won't last very long. But there are lots of different ways of making sense of the world. And we know that. But unfortunately, the public discourse, as it is, settled on one put forward by Aristotle in about, I don't know, 300 and something, 350 BC. And Aristotle came up with this idea that you could make complete sense of the world with 3 rules. And that's called rational logic. And now we all have to pretend that our making sense of the world is done through rational logic. Of course, others like Daniel Kahneman have done lots of experiments to prove we don't think like that at all. And I don't think we do with bells, really. I think I like bells. Bells appeal to me sort of with some inner way. And I think that's why bells play the part in our lives that they do. And we can see that when we look at the poems of Tennyson and Betjeman, which give people pleasure just reading and hearing about bells. So those are the kind of perspectives. And then the other bit of framing for the talk is the timeline. And so what we're going to do, we start way back when, and we carry on up to now. And there are 2 things that made a big difference that enable us to do what we do today. And there's one thing that makes a little bit of difference. So the big difference was the early Christians and the Romans. And the second big difference was the Reformation. And you'll see why that was important when we get there. And then there's the Belfry Reform movement. And we'll just have appear down a couple of little side roads, one about China and Asia, and one about the Americas. So, early days. So something like 60,000 years BC, and I do mean 60,000 years BC, that's the earliest we kind of discovered that people like music. And the thing on the left is probably the oldest bit of music artifact that Wikipedia can come up with. And it's a thigh bone of a young cave bear. Oh, sorry, it was originally. It's now believed to be a flute or a thigh bone of an old cave bear with 2 holes in it, depending which way you look at it. And it's believed that people like making music. They like singing from almost Neanderthal times forward. And then in the middle, you've got a sort of very early bell. And a lot of the early bells were ceramics or clay, motley clay. And I think I've seen one. Well, I know I've seen one. It was in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, but unfortunately you rush through there so fast, you don't have time to read the labels properly. But I think that said 4000 BC. And you can imagine that in those days, life was very simple in that, you know, if it started flooding, it was fairly obvious that you hadn't paid enough attention to the rain god. So you did something about the rain god and the floods went away and all was good. So if you were worried about things going bump in the night and eating your goat, you might ring a bell and then the thing would go away and your goat wouldn't get eaten. And then sometime later, you might think, hang on, if I hang the bell around the goat, that's even better because A, the goat won't get eaten, 2, I'll be able to find the goat in the morning. So that's a big winner. So we know that people are combining this kind of spiritual approach, maybe with a little bit of practicality. But although there's random ceramic bell evidence from a number of different places, they don't survive that well to make much of a story out of it. Now, round about 2600 BC, the Egyptians managed a process called lost wax molding, which enables you to make sort of coppery, bronzy things. And that was the start of the kind of bronze bells that we got, which were established by sort of 2200 BC. And you can see some examples up there in the right-hand corner. And most of it stemmed from there, these little bells used for various different purposes. And some of it was spiritual and welcoming. And Others were slightly more offensive. So we know from 500 BC in a play of Aeschylus that he talks about somebody having bells all around the edge of his shield, so that terror in their tone clang and reverberate the brazen bells, i.e. just using it to frighten his enemies. And in 200 AD, the Scots, or the Maetai from the Scots Central Belt, were using the same tactic with the Romans. They tied bells to their spears so that they rattled, and hopefully they terrified the Romans. I don't expect that worked very well. I imagine the Romans were made of a bit sort of sterner stuff than that. But we've got lots of evidence of this evolution of the small brass bell. Now, if we look at something a bit more impressive, and we take our little trip down the side road to China. China have been much smarter at this bell business than we have. So on the left there, you see some ancient Chinese small handbells. At the bottom, you can see the bell tower in Beijing. If you ever go to Beijing, go there. And if you go to Beijing, they actually have a very fine bell museum with bells from all over Asia, and in fact from the UK as well. And then on the top right, you see the things they put, and I don't really understand what they're doing with these. They're little sort of like chiming bells that you can play. And I went to the Chinese National Exam Center once for some reason I never understood when I was there. So to amuse myself, I tapped out Stedman on their little ring of bells, which I think convinced me that I was convinced them that I was confused and mad. But we'll come back to the big ones later, because the Chinese got into big bells. They got into all sorts of bells really much earlier. So we know that they got to the 5-note scale around about 2590 BC. By 500 BC, they could make a bell up to 800 kilograms, nearly a ton, a decent sized bell. And in 1300 BC, they mastered sand casting. Now, that's the technique we've now just got with the Wesley foundries. So Whitechapel and Taylor's were never really very keen on this. They didn't quite get there. And still people say, oh, there's something different about loam cast bells we must keep to. But the Chinese got there, 3,500 years ago. So they were a bit ahead of the game of us, really. And we know that they wanted bells of great size in sort of 200 BC. We know by the time we get to sort of more modern times, they had a bell of 50 tons in 1463, which was a decent sized bell. The one in the middle there, which I think is from the Ming dynasty, which is in the big bell tower, that was somewhere between 1368 and 1644 AD. That's 42 tons. And you can see those kind of bells, you hit them with a giant sort of tree trunk, and the monks pull the tree trunk back and then let it swing into the bell. That's their clappering. So big bells is their thing. And down there on the right is a rather slightly obscure picture, and I don't pronounce this very well, but this is the great bell of Dahmazidi, which was cast in Rangoon, which weighed 297 tons and believed to be the biggest bell ever. And it's cast in 1484. Unfortunately, in 1608, a Portuguese warlord turned up to steal it. He fancied having his own bell, but he was obviously a pretty rubbish warlord, because he put it on a raft to float it round the down the river. He wanted to make cannon, apparently, for more warlording, and his raft capsized. So it's sitting at the bottom of the river. People claim to know where it is, and every now and again somebody makes a threat to raise it. didn't do him any good either, because he ended up being impaled. So he had an unlucky time all round, and we don't have the bell anymore. The latest big Chinese bell was 116 metric tons, which was cast in 2000. But it's not just China and Malaysia, it's India has bells. The oldest bell foundry, continuous bell foundry in the world, is in Japan, in Osaka, which has been running since, I don't know, 1130 something or the other. So a great tradition of old bells and very early advances in technology, although people know they cast them a funny shape and they don't make nice notes to our ears. If we look at the Americas, just to show that these things are ubiquitous, really, the metalworks, they've been going since about 1500 BC, but they're mostly these little sort of, I'd call them investment casting. They're called crotal bells, where you have a bell with a little slit and you have some kind of sort of bead or rattly thing in it. And that progressed from the bottom of South America up to Mexico over about 1,000 years. And the one at the bottom there is an Inca one, because the Incas like making theirs out of gold. They like gold, do Incas. And then you can see the picture shows somebody having a nice wave of their bell. These either generated spontaneously, or if you like to believe Thor Heyerdahl and the Voyage of the Ra, you could say there's a slight possibility that they migrated from Egypt. It is the same technology that they just used in Egypt, but I don't think there's much evidence that it was sort of carried straight across there. Then we turn and we start looking at the early religions. So where are we? The chap on the left is Dionysus. He's a statue. And the chap on the right is Bacchus, unless I've got that the wrong way round. And Bacchus is the Roman version, Dionysus is the Greek version. And you can see that Dionysus is clutching a bunch of grapes, and Bacchus appears to be either on his way to or his way from some really good party. Knowing that there might be some minors watching this, I've taken out some of the even naughtier party images about things that Bacchus got up to. But both of these, or the same one, continuous, are associated with bells. So bells are closely associated in the worship of Dionysus, or Bacchus as he became. And I always think it's rather nice, in view of what happened later, that drink and bells are quite closely associated from a very early time. Mercury was also actually worshipped with bells, and I think that was because of messengers, so he probably had to ring a bell to tell people to get out of his way, was Mercury. And the one down the bottom there on the left is Mithras. And Mithras is quite a funny sort of god thing. I don't know whether it was a god or a cult. He was it was certainly the place that warriors went to worship, and it had to be a little bit on the secretive side. And the reason it had to be a bit on the secretive side is because it was all warriors and there was lots of civil wars and all this kind of thing going on. You're quite likely to meet some bloke you've been fighting on the field yesterday when you went to church, and you had to be terribly, terribly civilized about it and not fight in the church. So that tended to be a bit sort of underground cultish. They had 7 grades of being a devotee of Mithras, and the bell was the symbol of grade 2, so pretty lowly ranked really was the bells. Now on the right we've got a bit of scroll of an Old Testament, and this was a curious thing really, in that in religion, nearly every religion had bells. It had bells to ward off evil spirits, it had bells for good luck, bells around the door, wind chimes, all sorts of things, apart from the Abrahamic religions, or the Jewish religion, depending which way you look at it. And well, we know we're not allowed graven images, and you think we'd be allowed maybe a little bell, but obviously, as we know from reading our Bible, the Jews at that stage were a bit more ambitious. When they wanted a noise, they went for the brazen trumpet and the cymbal. They didn't bother fiddling around with these little tiny bells. And so you always get, always amuses me when we get a bell ringer service for a priest who doesn't know us very well. They will go, I looked in the Bible, and the only reference I can find to bells is Exodus 28, verse 33. Make pomegranates of blue, purple, and scarlet yarn round the hem of the garment with gold bells between them. And you think that's a rum thing, that's the only reference to bells in the Bible. How odd. The other odd thing about it is, of course, it's also slightly practical. And this is a story expounded by one of the old Victorian clergymen, and his explanation was, well, this is the robe for the high priest, and the high priest is the only person allowed to go in the Holy of Holies, and he has to go in on his own. So one of the problems you've got is what happens if the high priest conks out when he's in the Holy of Holies? You know, all sorts of bad things could happen to him in there. Well, we don't want to send somebody rushing in because that's not good. We were told not to do that. On the other hand, we don't want a slowly niffy, decaying high priest cluttering up the Holy of Holies, because that can't be what anybody wants either. So the thought was, if you tied a rope round the leg of the high priest and he had a tinkly robe, then you're sorted, because while you can hear the tinkling, you know he's still moving around. And if it goes a bit quiet, you give a yank on the rope. And if he starts tinkling again, you know all is fine. And if you yank on the rope and there's no more tinkles when you're not yanking on the rope, you know it's time to haul him out smartish. So it may well have been that was purely a practical thing. So we've talked a little bit about the Chinese were very good at this. Now the Romans did get into practical bells. They're very practical people. It's always said that the Greeks gave us plays and poetry, and the Romans gave us drains and roads. So they had bells, and they used bells for opening the market, as well as their religious things, opening the market. They used them to tell you when the baths were open, and more importantly, when the water had got cold. So they were obviously going up in scale of bells, and they went up in scale. They couldn't make very big castings because they hadn't discovered this new way of casting that the Chinese had done about 2,500 years earlier. And so they got sheets of metal and they riveted them together, up to 4 sheets of metal. And so they had these sort of metal cans with a sort of dangly clapper, which must have been fairly dismal. But there's a curious story about how they began trade in the China, as we know about bells. We've established that they've got good bells. They're where Wesley is. They're fine. But China spends a lot of its history not talking to anybody, and then some of its history really reaching out across the known globe of the time. And at one particular junction of this, the Han dynasty, they were having a bit of trouble on their western border, and I think it's when they built the wall as well. And one of their troubles in life is that the people on their western border were sort of these Mongolian cavalry people, and they would come running in with their archers, shoot the Chinese, run off. And the Chinese had truly rubbish horses. Somebody said they were lack of selenium, but they were really crappy horses. So they felt a bit disadvantaged. So what they needed to do was trade for some horses. And so we know that the best horses come from Arabia and the Mongolian steppes and places like that, round about here. And so they started that. And of course, they had to have something to trade with. And the thing they traded with at the start, obviously grew as they went along, was silk, which is why the routes are called Silk Road. And Rome absolutely went mad for silk, couldn't get enough of it. So this kind of trade then led to other things, spices and what have you, but also led to cultural exchanges, as we would call them these days. It led to ambassadors going from one side of the world to the other, as it was. and exchanging technologies and understanding. And you can imagine that if you were into public messaging and you went to China and you saw the sunken great bell cast in the tower, and then you went and somebody got their little tin can they were waving at, you would think, I think we better get a shift on here, guys. We're kind of losing this race. So there's a move to understand this different form of casting technology. And if we just look at that briefly, I'll do this quickly because this is more of an engineering-y type thing. So the lost wax process, which is the one on the left, which is what the Romans, the Egyptians, the South Americans were using. You make your thing, in this picture, a head. You carve it out of wax, all nice and pretty. You put some mud around it to make a mold. You can melt the wax out of the mold, and now you get a hole you can pour your bronze in. That kind of works very well for smallish things. If you want to do a 100-ton bell, the wax won't hold up very well. And particularly in a hot country, the wax will melt, you won't get a shape. And indeed, you've got a slight problem. We know from some excavations in Chichester, they use things like dolphins in the wax. So if you want to make a ring of 12, you've got to go and hunt down a whole load of dolphins, which would be a bit sort of bit of a task. Whereas on the right-hand side, we've got the more common process that we see now, where you make a clay mold, you pour the thing in the top, and then you break the clay mold off. Now, actually, the transition wasn't that quick, in that they started off with replacing some of the wax, and then as the bells got bigger, slowly they did less and less wax, and more just empty old clay. So we've got a change of technology here. We don't really know the extent, and we run into this trouble about what happened with the iron bells, because we do know that of the number of Roman bells discovered in Britain, there's 303, I think, have been discovered in the public antiquities schedule, or whatever it's called, but only 8 of them are iron, but the rest may have rusted, so we don't really know. And there is an intermediate stage where they made an iron bell and then they tried to dip it in bronze to make it sound a bit nicer, but that was probably rubbish as well. The other thing, of course, is the going upstairs. Now, we know that they had watchtowers, because you would do, because you've got to watch people coming. We know they wanted to signal the start of the market, the hours of the day. We know they did the hours of the day in London. And you can imagine they started off by running up the ladder, hanging out of the window and ringing their rubbishy iron bell. And we know they did that because there's a tradition of round towers in Ireland, where the church set up a similar schema. And you can imagine it wasn't very long before some smart Roman said, I'm fed up with running up and down that ladder every day. Why don't I mount my bell on a little pivot, have a piece of string and ring it from the bottom? So this is why I call this a jump forward. We've now learned how to make a proper cast bell, and we've learned how to put it at the top of a tower. So we've got towers, cast bells. We're on our way to be able to ring a nice touch of Cambridge. Although in practice, it took quite a long time for this to take effect. Now, they probably got into the one of the good things was that it was adopted by the church, and we know that in 420, Paulinus of Nola was credited with introducing bells in church services and the use of handbells. Of course, the early church was, A, it was underground, as it were, and 2, it was it didn't have places to meet. It either met in a cave or met in somebody's house, and it certainly wouldn't want to advertise its presence with bells, because you're likely to end up as a upside down on a cross, lighting somebody's way to a party. So it's going to take some time before the church is actually going to want proper bells. But they settled on setting up an industry in a place called Campania, or a region called Campania, which is just by Naples, just behind Naples there. And the interesting thing about that is that it gave us the word campanile, a tower with bell in, and campanology. And the even better thing about it, which I discovered fairly recently, is there's a Italian word campanalismo. And campanalismo is about being much more proud of where you've come from, your town or your city, than you are about the country. So if you might be very proud about being a Neapolitan, but not particularly interested in being Italian. Some of us who come from Devon might feel like that. You know, it's obviously a great thing to come from Devon. Why would you worry that it's part of England? So that obviously came from a sort of boasting about how big your bell tower was. So we've got a situation here now where we've not only getting into bell towers, but we've got some kind of street cred and boastfulness about having big bell towers. And then one of the interesting things there is we used to talk about the Whitechapel being a very old business. The Marinelli foundry, which is just north of Naples, it's slightly outside the Campania region, which is a bit of a shame, was founded in 1339 and is still run by the same family. And that's a picture of it and its museum above. It's not actually the proper building, because that burnt down, because foundries do burn down quite regularly, but it is still the same family running it since 1339, which is quite remarkable. And so we now have the adoption by the early Christians. Now, obviously, we're going to start off with a sort of handbell thing, and the thing in the centre is St. Patrick's bell, as we think of it today. I suspect it's been heartily blinged up, because the one beneath it is a more typical sort of Irish bell, and you could see that if you were a sort of missionary type person going around, an itinerant preacher, having a bell to get people to come and listen to you was obviously pretty much a necessity of life. St. Patrick took it a bit further, actually. He wanted to leave a bell everywhere he went, and in his traveling company, he had a couple of tinsmiths, or we call them now, people who could bang some metal sheets together, and he'd leave a bell behind him wherever he went. And then they got into the tradition of the round towers that people go up and they could ring their bell out of the window. We know that St. Jerome in 420 mentions the use of using bells to call people to matins. Now, from not wanting any bells and maybe having a brazen trumpet, we've now seemed to adopt bells, whether that was just messaging and signaling, come to my church, or whether it was the early church's desire to kind of take over things from other religions to make that management of change thing a bit easier. I don't think we can ever tell. But that kind of moved on. So we know on the continent that in the year sort of 622 in Verona, they'd actually got bells in towers. So that bit was going well. And Bede in 680 talks about there being a decent bell in Whitby, which was rung for the passing of St. Hilda. And we know that bells were introduced in Crowland and similar sort of places, but it's still a kind of patchy thing. And then another quite good thing happens from the point of view of bells. They became not just a religion, but a mass communication thing. So on the left is Alfred's Bergs. Now, Alfred the Great, obviously we know he was very threatened by the Danes. So the Danes, well, some of the Danes lived here and they kept nicking the land going this way, and other Danes got in their boats and kept being a nuisance sort of coming up here. Now, the thing about the Danes is they weren't very patient. people. They liked a quick rape and pillage. They didn't like hanging about. So Alfred had this strategy of burghs, a fortified place where the local population could run to behind the fortifications. Vikings wouldn't really be interested in doing a siege, but if they did, it would give, if they did want to stay around, it would give people time to raise the militia, or the Fid as they were called, and they could get a decent army and come and drive the Vikings away. So we've got this little network of, or well, not a network of burghs, but we've also got the idea of central defense points that people can run to. And of course, we can have a bell in them to tell people that it's time to run to your defense point. And Alfred's grandson, Athelstan, he decreed in 926 that you could be a thane if you got possession of 600 acres and you built a church with a bell tower. And so that kind of set up a little intermediary thing. And you can imagine you could also stand on top of your tower and see where the Vikings had got to. So you could get advance warning, you could call people in, you could maybe communicate from parish to parish. And so it's very handy to have lots of bell towers scattered around all your parishes. So you can defend your people, you can not fall prey to these Danes or whatever's going to come, Normans or whoever. But for us, it's really good because now we've got lots of towers with at least a bell in them scattered around at least the southern part of England. So we're on our way to having a good bell ringing infrastructure set up here. There's a few snags with this, of course. We tend to think that bells are bell-shaped, but of course they weren't at that stage. So you've got three examples here. You've got an Italian bell from Verona at top left. You've got two of the allegedly oldest bells in England, bloody, bloody, blah, which are the Iwade bells. There are a number of contenders for this, and I'll get to why that's difficult later. And then on the right, you've got a German bell, which is from Bad Hersfeld, and that is actually dated, and that's dated to 1038, and it's about a 1 ton bell, so it's just, you know, that decent bell. If you go on Wikipedia, you can hear its note or notes, which is truly awful. It's called Lullusglocke, after St. Lullus, who was an aide to St. Boniface, which I was like, because all good Devonians know that St. Boniface came from Crediton, and he was called the unifier of Europe due to his work in taking Christianity to the Germans. I said there's not a lot, but there's quite a number of these sort of English bells, the bottom left picture. In fact, there's Tuat Kennet of that form, and Raven, in his list of Cambridge bells, he puts those down to being mid-12th century, but there's no real way of knowing because they have no inscription, no founding marks, and there's no sort of ecclesiastical records that give you a clue. Now, we might have been en route for a nice bit of ringing here, but the trouble is that bells started going very big. So we know that the 7 bells at Exeter in 1050 required 63 ringers. So, you know, peals of sinks are going to require a peal organizer of a tremendous capability. We know that St. Albans had big bells. We know that Canterbury in 1160 had a bell that was alleged to weigh 16 tons and required 32 people to ring it. So although we've now got towers and bells, we haven't got anything we can do much useful with. It's a bit unfortunate. There's a need now to sort of, with these big bells, there's a need to think how they hang and how they evolve. And I quite like the bottom right picture. That's Leonardo da Vinci's sketch for a new bearing system for bells. He put his fingers in every pot. So, yep, bell hanging was his job as well. And on the left, you've got some pictures from a book published in 1540 by Ringuccio, which is looking at different ways of hanging these big bells. And Biringuccio was the first person to write a good book about bell casting and bell hanging, but also cannons, all sorts of things. Prior to that, people had tended to keep these things, well, and after that, for that matter, they tended to keep these things a secret rather than share them about. I talked a bit about the difficulty of dating old bells. So here's a kind of evolution. The early ones had no marks on them at all, so it's very difficult to tell. And then at some point in time, people started writing on them. And when they started writing on them, of course, unfortunately started doing this before anybody had invented modern typeface like Courier or Times New Roman. So they use this thing called Lombardic script, which is like when you see medieval manuscripts, it's the sort of elegant capitals that you see on it, and quite difficult to read. So we know when that happened, and we know when it stopped because we know when printed started. But also we know that at a point in time, people started putting founders marks or founders stamps on it, which is the top right-hand bit there. And that came about because in 1266, the two things that were very early being regulated were bread and beer. So bread because you could put sawdust in it and underweight it, and beer because you could dilute it. So there was an order went out that you had to put a mark on your bread. So we knew who was adulterating the bread, and that spread to a lot of other things, and it spread to bells. So this then meant that those who can do good history can start tracing these bell founders. And it was quite difficult at the start because obviously surnames weren't very good. So Beltier was the name of was just the word for bell founder. So a lot of bell founders were just called bell founder, which didn't allow you to discriminate very easily. And then you get, so somebody's about 5 bell founders in Cambridge, and somebody was tracing those, and you get, is Richard Holdfield the same as Robert Oldfield, until things got sort of more settled in terms of how we deal with surnames. And then you get to the bell down the bottom on the right-hand side, which is an Allegheny bell. So that's a modern bell, and you can see you can write whatever you like on that. So should you be minded to respond to the appeal for St. Clement's, which I think Barry's looking at Allegheny bells, you could probably have your picture put on it if you like. So you can certainly have name, date, place, but you could have all sorts of pretty patterns. So bells before the Reformation, what have we got? This picture is not relevant at all, but who can resist a giant rabbit? So the big abbeys and the big places will probably have 4 bells, 5 bells. They'll be exceedingly large and unringable. In the context of what we want to do, they would have taken many people to ring them. Parish churches typically would have had 3 bells. And the oldest example we have is in Bartlow, which I think we think is about 1440, which is a pretty typical example of a parish church. And the bells wouldn't be particularly matched. Mostly they might ring in pairs, but nobody really cares what note they are or what order they are. The whole thing is about big. And therefore, from our point of view, unringable. So second leap forward. So here we have a period of time where we went through quite a number of monarchs. So we've got Henry, Edward VI, Henry VIII, we've got Mary I, and we've got good Queen Bess, Elizabeth I. So let's just see what they did. So Henry VIII, jolly good. He wanted an easier divorce. He got through 6 wives. He was finding it hard to get through those. So he thought he would have his own church and he'd be the Pope. He spent a lot of money. That was a bummer. And one way of getting his money back was to sell off a lot of monasteries, because now he was Pope, they all belonged to him. And Also, coincidentally, there was a shortage of bronze because they were also trying to expand the navy. And bronze cannons are rather nicer than iron cannons. You can make iron cannons, but bronze ones are better. So if you've got monasteries with lots of big bells in them, that's lots of cannons. So sell the monastery, sell the bell. It was a kind of swings and roundabouts thing, because obviously Henry did well out of this. Henry's mates did well out of this, but probably 1 in 50 people were actually in a monastery. There were lots of monasteries, and a lot of other people sold things to monasteries. So getting rid of all the monasteries didn't please everybody. So Henry dies, and his immediate successor was Edward VI, and he was a lad. Didn't last very long as well, died probably tuberculosis. And at that point, the church went Protestant. Henry hadn't actually been terribly worried about that, or some of the people advising him did. The church was still reasonably Catholic, but with Henry in charge of it. That's what he wanted, and the money from the monastery. But Edward, or the people who stood in for him, particularly Somerset, wanted the church to go Protestant. And Somerset, he was one of these guys who liked to please people. So he was a bit of an appeaser. And that had the opposite effect to what you might think, in that it caused a lot of riots, rebellions, and commotion. So if you look at the map, there was well over 100 in 1 year, covering all of England, apart from the northwest. Our particular contribution was, there was something called the Land Beach Commotion, which was really just a small riot. There was camps of 6,000 people at Norwich. And locally in Cambridge, there was an attack by the townspeople on the bailiff over at Barnwell. And this is a really curious thing. The alderman called on the university to help them put the riot down, and they went and got the chancellor and sort of heads of houses. And it just beggars belief these days that you would go and get the vice chancellor and the university people to put a riot around them, unless they were going to bore them to death. You can't conceivably think how it was going to work. But that kind of worked well for us, in a sense, is that the fallout from that was what gave us Stourbridge Common, Coldham's Common, Lammas Land, and all these things actually protected as commons. It didn't work out well for everybody, because there are records of money being spent on gallows and ropes and stuff like that. So some people lost out, but in terms of where we are today, we won out big. Mary, we know about Mary. Mary liked burning people. She wanted to be a Catholic. She was quite keen on it. She burnt poor old Cranmer. He didn't mind which religion he was, provided he didn't get burnt. And she said, well, you're going to get burnt. You can decide what religion you get burnt as, which wasn't a great place to find himself. She married a future king of Spain. That didn't go down awfully well. And her third bit of bad luck was that she was very unlucky with the weather. So there was a lot of famine, there was a lot of poor harvests. So by the time we get to the next queen, good Queen Bess, country's pretty much down on its heels. And what she did was she re-established the Protestant church. She wasn't keen on burning people. She got some money, which she mainly got from stealing from the Spanish and establishing colonies. And she said, okay, people need to be happier, so they stopped rioting and moaning. So go to church and then have fun. And she introduced the concept of having fun. This led to the idea of ringing as an exercise. And so you can imagine the bells we had got, they were just so rough. So it really was exercise to do something with them, to ring them up, ring some changes, ring them down. And we got to the idea of societies, of people who did this as a bit of amusement. This was their fun. We know about the Ancient Society of College Youths, and we know about the Cumberlands. And the chap in the middle is Lord Brereton. And this amuses me because the college youths were supposed to be gentlemen originally, and he was their first master. The reason he was a gentleman was that I think it was his granddad, had the role of groom of the Privy Chamber. So essentially he wiped Henry VIII's bottom, which is a good way of getting on in the world by the look of it. And that's obviously the kind of gentleman that was attracted to the college youth. The gentleman thing died away, they said, fairly quickly in favour of clever tradesmen, and so they became more the membership. And then we get the idea of method ringing, and the chap down the bottom there is Fabian Stedman, and you can have which Stedman story you like. You can have the John Eisel Stedman story of he was a member of the Cheapside Scholars and their treasurer and a college youth, and he was in London. Or you can have the Raven version of Stedman, which was a printer resident in Cambridge who printed out slips in his leisure time, and it was all invented in St. Benet's. And this is what I like about history. Never either of those. Me, I'll go with Ravens. That's much happier. And at this time, there's a poem written that hints at the development of the Sally. And bear in mind, for this, there were no sort of Sallies. So you're ringing on bare rope, bad bells. So we need some improvement in bell hanging. You can see there, that's actually the Bartlow Tower. So commonly you got 3 bells in a row in a frame that had no structural stability. And we've got quite a number of those in Cambridgeshire still, or they've been taken upstairs, or they've been built up into more stronger frames. And then on the right-hand side, you've got a picture of a more modern bell. Haslingfield, where I ring, was one of the first ones to have a new strong oak frame, which is rather good. And the second thing is to tune the bell. So I talked about the early bells not being in tune. Here's a picture of section through a bell. We went through being able to know what the sound bow does, how you tune the sound bow, to what do the other bits of the bell do, to how do you get a bell to be in its own 5 notes to be in tune with each other, to how do you get a set of bells to be in tune with each other. And that was done. We have the thing about Simpson tuning. Tailors would say it's Taylor's tuning, but we developed the whole mathematics of how you actually produce nice sounding bells. Prior to the Reformation, nobody had cared what they sounded. They were just to make a noise. So this is all for pleasure still, and we've got these examples of disgraceful behaviour. Now, you've all seen the thing on the left, which is for every fault a jug of beer. On the right, you've got a jug of beer. Some of the jugs of beer were 4 gallons. So for every fault you made in your ringing, you could be penalised 4 gallons of beer. You can imagine people never got through the end of the first touch, probably. Certainly practice nights will be very joyful. John Bunyan, we know, he gave up ringing because it was too dissolute. The competitions were good. They show that we're very sort of boring in our competitions these days. So Devon call changes had rows where the 2 and the tenor alternate every other row. So on 4, that's 3142, 3145, 3142, 3145. On 4, it would be 43152, 43156, which they called 8s and 10s. And I think that's all very cool. At Sawston, they had a competition on doubles, and you had to ring St Dunstan's The Dream and Fortune doubles, which I thought a good set. And at St Mary's Wallingford in 1786, which is a heavy ring of 8, a ringer was challenged to ring all the bells up by himself. He had to ring them up with one hand inside 20 minutes. And that was the sort of thing people bet on. Now, why we're not running that kind of competition at the Catholic, I do not know. We've just no imagination these days at all. That sounds like a lot of fun. So we also had bell ringers were bricked out of the tower. They had the separate steps, so on. That spawned the belfry reform movement. Now, it's a college youth picture on the left, and it's a bit unkind because it's actually ringing the New Year in at St Giles Cripplegate. Now, I have rung the New Year in, and things have been merry, though I would like to say most of the merriment took place after the ringing. I've probably got my fingers crossed behind my back there, but I can see why. So we got these drunken, dissolute ringers. And the church was trying to get its act in order after a period of sort of being on its knees. And so the Belfry Reform movement said we ought to change ringing to be part of the church. And you get these pictures on the right where everybody in the picture looks like my granddad, really, apart from the guy with the white moustache. There's a nice quote from the Reverend William Lucas. There are sets of men who ring for what they can get, which they consume in drink, but there is little love for the science or its music, and alas, much irreverence and profanation of the house of God. There is no plucking at the bells for recreation and exercise. Church ringers with us have degenerated into mercenary performers. So there was a reaction against all that, and part of that was the foundation of diocesan societies, and the chap on the left is Ellicombe, and the first society was the Guild of Devonshire Ringers down there. And the thing on the right is the T, because a story my father always used to tell me was that the foundation of the EDA was about promoting recruitment to ringers by providing a meat tea once a month, paid for by the clergy. So rather than being up there drunk with your jug of ale, the idea was you were going to be enticed by a meat tea once a month paid by the vicar. This is certainly true. So my father will have known people who knew the start of the EDA. I'm sure of that, because in fact I probably did as well, although I was very young at the time. But looking at that, we do know that the clergy at the start, we have the subscription rates, did pay a much higher fee than ringers. And it's only in sort of modern years we now we went to letting the clergy in free and not making them pay for the tea, which is yet another sign of standards slipping. And one of the things I want to do at the end is to point out that this exercise that we now get our enjoyment from is based on a tremendous amount of effort from many, many, many people over the years, and there are too many to mention. So I pulled out one person, I used to know as Reggie Dennis, friend of my father's, and you can read here that he was in office to the association from 1912 to 1965. He had all offices and he was a vice president. But that's not just all that's interesting about Reggie Dennis. In his obituary in the 1966 report, my father told me this story as well. It says, a friend called for T-Reg at his home in Clarendon Street, Cambridge, on the evening of August the 2nd, and drove him to ring at St Mary's, Ely. There he rang perfectly in a well-struck touch of Stedman triples. A few minutes later, listening no doubt to those fine bells, he peacefully and almost silently passed away. And I always remember that story, and I think of that, and I think, what a wonderful end for a wonderful man. And so on that, I'd like to finish. Thank you for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Tom. I do, unfortunately, I forgot to mention right at the beginning that if people have questions, they should enter them into the Q&A, which you can find at the bottom of the screen. You might need to click some buttons to get to it, but do put in your questions if you have some. Thank you very much indeed for that, Tom. It's really very interesting, and yes, talks about like you say, the first 60,000 years of people making music using percussive instruments isn't usually all that talked about, or using instruments. Yes, in the context of bell ringing, we're far too focused on the last on the last sort of 100 years. So we've got a couple of questions in already. So Mark Norris asks, when did full circle ringing start?
Well, we do kind of know that. I think John Eisel knows that. And he guesses at 1610 for what they called sixes, which was all the change on 3 bells, and then 24s, which was all the change on 4 bells. What we do know is that there was quite a big jump. We know the number of bells per church has been inventoried quite a number of times, and shortly after that there was actually a big jump from 3 bell towers to 5 bell towers. So that kind of gives the indication that there was a big, very rapid sort of growth in that kind of full circle ringing rather than 3 in a row.
Yeah, and I suppose there's sort of a question of, because obviously, there's the development of the half wheel, the 3/4 wheel, perhaps. I think the evidence for the 3/4 wheel is perhaps more scant, is it?
Yeah, so in fact, they do talk about bells being rung on half wheel, even for the pre-Reformation bells, and for people's sort of knowledge there, the half wheel, you only get to pull on 1 stroke. So you imagine you've got your 8-ton bell and you're going to swing that around and you only get to pull on 1 of the strokes. So that's why it was the exercise. So a 3/4 wheel bell, I think you can get to balance, but you're still only pulling 1 stroke and you're snookered if you go over the top, and there were no sliders and stays. And so it's only when you get to the full wheel that you can ring in the style we do today. Campanologica, Stedman talks about, now we've got wheels and stays and sliders. So it was probably sometime prior to 1677, sort of that order, that they made this jump to bells that you can ring now. But you can imagine, half wheel, pull every other stroke, and you've no Sally. And an 8-ton bell, how good's that going to be as a ringing experience?
Yes. Sort of, compare it to modern ringing, of course, which is, obviously, if anything like the current situation happens again, people will be looking back saying, how did they manage ringing room with their internet connection so poor? And every 5 minutes there'd be just this massive clanging of bells all together. Or hopefully not. So hopefully study of ringing room won't be a large historical topic. Just a couple of comments that came in. A comment from Penny says, coming from Devon is the best. You're absolutely right about that. And Sue has commented that the Lulu's Glock really does sound truly dreadful.
So I just looked it up actually. Yeah. I think it's B Norton C or something is its notes, which is not a combination you hear very often.
Yeah, so there you go. There's a bit of homework for everyone. Please do look up this truly wonderful note. And if nobody else has any other questions, we'll have a question from Anand, who just simply asks, how did you get interested in bell history?
I think I got pushed into it. So because I'm the bell advisor, every time you want to make a move, you have to delve into, is this bell or is this frame of significance? So that got me into probably the post-Reformation bells, because I've had to go to places like Bartlow and Kennet and so on and so forth, and tried to figure out what they are and where they come from. But I must admit, I've found the Chinese bell development really interesting as well, and over Asia. The fact that they were so far in front of us, I find quite remarkable. Yeah.
Yeah. There you are. I don't see any more questions. I think, it's, like I say, fabulous talk. Thank you very much indeed for entertaining us this evening. Yes, wonderful. Like I mentioned, the next talk is going to be on the 11th of February. There'll be details in due course. But I think that's more or less it for tonight. Tom, if you'd like to say your farewells.
Oh yes, I'll say my farewell. The only thing I didn't mention for the Devon thing is I'd hoped Richard Pargeter would be on, because the Devon riots were led for Stamford Courtney, and I don't know if that was the Pargeters getting angsty again.
I have to say, I don't know that Richard is here this evening, but we can always point it in his direction afterwards.
Yeah.
Available.
So, Bolsham people, watch out for some people from Stamford Courtney. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening. And thanks, Dave, for organising the series.
No problem.